if you want to practice an embodiment practice, if you want to embody your deepest experience of being, telling the truth is about as good and direct as it gets. And most people think that they basically are truthful. They basically, and to one extent, I guess, people are relatively truthful, but when you really look at it for a given day, and how do I embody the truth of being? Well, I start by telling the truth. What could be more simple? What could be more direct and obvious? I want to embody the most truthful experience of being that I know in my life, in my relative experience, through my humanity. How do I do that? Well, you start by telling the truth all the time. Okay, great. What is the truth then? Right? So we're not talking about absolute truths. We're talking about what seems to be true for you. You could think of truth also in terms of being totally honest all the time, totally sincere all the time, never deceptive, never deceiving, not only in obvious ways, but all those little ways that you can twist a sentence where you're just a little bit deceptive, where you're not really being completely honest, maybe 85% honest, but not completely honest, you know? And when you really look at this, even for a single day, you endeavor to tell the truth and tell it all the time, you will probably be surprised. You might even be shocked by how often you find yourself shading truths, whether it's out of fear, whether it's out of a kind of subtle or overt deception because you want to hide something, because you don't want to be that exposed, you don't want to be that real, you have a fear of being real. There's 101 reasons and 101 seemingly decent reasons why you might not tell the whole truth. Just tell the truth in terms of being honest, being real. Try that on for size. It's not as easy as you think. And it's very, very revealing. It's very demanding. Well, so, like I said, what is truth then? Well, it's not just mere opinion. It's not just the next conditioned thought that runs through your mind. I remember years ago when I gave a talk about telling truth, and a woman came up to me about a week after that, and she said, you know, Adya, you'll never guess what happened to me after that talk you said, that talk about the truth you had that night, or that day. And I said, yeah, what happened? And she told me the story of, after the talk, going out into the parking lot and being met there by one of her best friends, who also was at the talk. And her best friend said, well, Adya talked about telling the truth, so I'm going to tell you everything I have ever thought about you. And basically what she did was she proceeded to sort of dump her emotional garbage can onto this poor woman, you know, every projected idea and opinion and judgment and, you know, basically every nasty thought she had about her. And this poor woman came back and said, is that what you meant by telling the truth? And I assured her that no, that was not what I meant at all. That wasn't telling the truth. Telling the truth isn't just unloading your judgments on somebody. That's not really telling the truth. Like I said, telling the truth is more about being deeply and precisely honest. And telling the truth means being very open to having your truth change. Because someone else, their honesty, their truth, if they choose to speak it, may inform you. You might learn something. It might alter what's true for you. So as human beings, what we often do is we clutch on to what we think is true, and we when we do state it, we often state it with a fair amount of defensiveness, right? It's almost like we don't want to have our minds changed. We don't really want to be challenged. We don't want to let others tell their truth. And so we're often in a kind of secret competition. Even in the most casual, seemingly pleasant conversation, if you really listen to them, you will often notice a kind of very quiet, well-cultured competition going on. Or it's a kind of competition of ideas, or there's just a complete lack of listening. In the average conversation, usually each person is actually waiting for a gap where they can jump in and say what they want. When the other person is listening, they're not really listening that well. They're just waiting for their gap. And so this is really common in conversation, where part of truth-telling, at least in a conversational sense, is also listening, because it's interest in what's true, what might be true about any moment, true about any situation. You might have a disagreement. You might see something differently. You might state what's honestly true for you. But unless you listen for what's honestly true for somebody else, you're not really going to get anywhere. Your experience of truth may actually be wrong when you get somebody else's reflection. It may end up to be accurate. So for a lot of spiritual people, they would think, well, this doesn't sound particularly spiritual to me. This isn't meditation. This isn't realizing the self. This isn't awakening. This isn't esoteric. And I'll say, no, it's not. But it's demanding, and it's real. It's kind of where the rubber hits the road. If you were to take a day where you sort of saw your way of being through a very black and white lens, let's say, that either you're telling the truth or you're lying. So if you're shading a little bit, that means lying, right? Because human beings, especially adults, we never like to admit to ourselves when we're lying. We say, well, I'm shading, I'm not, and I'm doing it so for somebody else's, I'm doing it for their sake. Say somebody, your husband or your wife asks you how you like some piece of clothing they got. And maybe you actually think it's hideous, right? If you were to tell the truth, does that mean you just have to say, oh, that's hideous, darling, that's awful? Well, that could be one way of telling the truth. But if you have had a little sensitivity, you also realize there's more than one way to tell the truth. If you don't feel like you want to be that blatant, you could say, well, it's not really that important what I think. It's what do you think it is? How do you feel about it? No, but I want to know what you think. And there's lots of ways, you don't have to say, it's terrible, it's hideous. You can say something that's truthful and honest that may or may not be quite so overt, right? Well, it's not my favorite thing, or whatever it is. Or I like this about it, but that about it doesn't turn me on so much. So often when we get in situations where we tell ourselves that we're saving somebody else from our truth, that somehow to be untruthful, which means to be dishonest, is somehow good for them. That can be an underlying sort of belief. Is that really true? Is it really good for somebody to be dishonest with them? Doesn't honesty eventually win out? In the long run? So if you want to really start to embody even some of your deepest realizations of being, start by telling the truth. and tell it all the time. Will there be consequences to you telling the truth? Yeah, there will be. People won't always like it. But if you find that almost everybody doesn't like it, then you got to re-examine, how am I delivering the truth? Or is what I'm saying really true? Or am I not simply speaking the truth? Am I insisting upon the truth? Nobody likes it when we insist upon the truth. So if you get lots of feedback that you get lots of negative feedback about your truth-telling, it's a good idea to really look and see, exactly how am I delivering this truth? How insistent am I in? Or am I just simply, very simply, being honest and being real? Or am I being deceitful, dishonest, shading the truth? Because it's one of the ways that we human beings manipulate each other. We don't tell the whole truth. We shade it. So you shade the truth and you have this illusion that you can control somebody. If you tell the truth, well, it's like you've expressed your bottom line. You can't go back on that. It's hard to manipulate somebody when you've been totally truthful, totally honest. Now, here's the nice thing about doing this. Number one, it can and it will transform your life completely. If you have never really looked at this deeply, if you have never really made this a practice, or if you've never really put attention upon this, it almost certainly will transform your lives in ways that you probably can't even imagine. Now, to part of you, that probably feels really good and exciting, like a nice adventure. And a part of you that may feel kind of scary and frightening, because who knows what will happen? How will it transform my life? You can't really say until you do it. But however it transforms your life, it will be based in truthfulness, honesty, sincerity. So that's one benefit, that your life improves. It doesn't mean that some truths don't create chaos. Sometimes they do. If you're totally honest about something, it doesn't always mean it's going to work out the way you want. How it works out will not be in your control anymore. It'll be controlled by the truth, by honesty. Like I said, it's one of the reasons we're not really truthful with one another, because we want to maintain a sense of control, or we're afraid to, or maybe you feel like you were taught very early that your what was true for you had no importance, that you really weren't worthy of telling the truth or valuable enough to tell the truth, or whatever it is. When you endeavor to do this, you will inevitably run up against your hesitations, your fears, whatever they may be. But that's okay, because you run up against those things anyway eventually. But another nice thing is when you're just really truthful and really honest. I mean, how could you embody the enlightened condition without being truthful and honest? Just think about it. How could you ever possibly embody a spiritually awake or enlightened condition and be anything less than truthful? How could that ever happen? It couldn't happen. It won't happen. As you start to do this, one of the nice fringe benefits, you could say, is your experience of being tends to become richer and deeper and more profound and more connected with your human relative life. You stop feeling like there's this inner private space of being and then your outer human existence, and they're not really communicating. They're kind of two things. It's an illusion that there are two things. There aren't really two things. It's actually one thing. And one of the ways you find out that is by being truthful. The more truthful you are, the deeper your experience of being becomes, the deeper your sense of freedom becomes, the deeper your sense of connection becomes, the deeper your sense of that exquisite feeling of just sort of that beautifully, spontaneously balanced flow feeling, right? Where all of you is sort of together in one direction. Your internal division has come together, right? If you want to be divided, just be untruthful. Tell lies, tell little white lies, tell little innocent lies that you tell yourself don't matter. But they do matter, and the way you know they matter is because you will feel conflicted inside. Sometimes you'll feel that very overtly, and sometimes it will be very, very subtle. It'll be like the 10,000 ways that you are subtly dishonest with yourself. Well, how could you ever live in anything remotely like an awakened, spiritually awakened or enlightened condition when you're not telling the truth? Right? Truth is a unifier. It brings the forces of your psychology, your mind, your body, your emotions. It ultimately brings them together because you have a singular aim. You have a singular intention. You don't have multiple agendas. Some agendas you'll be truthful about, and some agendas you won't be so truthful because you want to try to control something. When it's just truth, there's something inside of you that comes deeply together. Eventually, if you've never done this and you start it, you might for a little while feel a little bit more disheveled, a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more fear because you're not used to doing it. But that's okay. You realize that by doing it, that you realize feeling those feelings are okay, that you can embody those, that you can live through that you're strong enough to go through the readjustment process where your relative humanity becomes in alignment with your deepest truth of being. As people, come to me all the time and they want to know, how do I live what I've experienced? And the tendency is to think, well, my deepest realization of being feels like freedom or openness, or there's no separate self, or some quality of experience. And they think that if I just try to hold on to that experience, that will enable me to be in that experience all the time. But it doesn't work that way. I hope you hear this. It does not work that way. It will never work that way. Because that truth has to be translated, if you want it to function in your life in a seamless way, in an unconfused, unconflicted way, if you want to be undivided, not just undivided in some absolute sense. In the absolute sense, you can have a realization of the absolute unity of all of existence. It's already unified. Nothing needs to be unified. At that dimension of being, everything is always and already perfect in a sense, right? And so when we realize that, there's a great tendency to clutch onto that, to cling onto it. But to cling on to it is not actually enlightenment. To cling on to it will not necessarily help you to live it. To live it, it needs to be translated down into relative terms. What helps you as a human being to become not only absolutely, to realize the absolute undividedness of being, but also experience the relative human undividedness of being. Well, truth is one of those things that brings your division together because it gives you a sole aim. Your aim is undivided. You are no longer not telling the truth. You are no longer being dishonest for any reason. You've just ceased to do it. When you get to the point where you've ceased to do it, you'll feel a deep coming together, a relative human psychological coming together, which will reflect, which will be capable of reflecting and embodying the deeper togetherness, the deeper unity of the essence of being.